In this section, we're going to take a deeper dive into intents. We're going to learn how to train a classifier to identify intents. We're also going to look at tips, tricks, and best practices that can be applied when training your classifier. And finally, we'll take a quick peek into the Watson conversation tooling for intents. So let's quickly refresh our memory. As we learned in a previous section, an intent is the purpose or goal expressed in a user's input. In order to use intents within our conversation, we need to train the Watson conversation service to identify the specific intents that are to be used by our application. As we described earlier, one such intent might be to tell me about something, or to describe it. So how do we train Watson to identify user utterances that express the purpose or goal of wanting to be told about something? We do this by training a classifier. In simple terms, a classifier can be thought of as a function that maps an input to a category. In our particular case, we want to map user utterances, the inputs, to an intent, the category. Training the intent classifier is simple. We don't have to be an expert in natural language processing or machine learning. All we have to do is provide a set of examples. On the slide here, you can see I have a snippet from intents.csv. It contains examples like tell me about Yosemite National Park, I'd like to know about Denali, or I want to know more about Yellowstone. All of these are examples that map to the tell me about intent. Once we provide this training data, the Watson conversation service will be able to identify this intent when it encounters similar utterances. When training a classifier, there are some tips, tricks, and best practices. The first and most important is to gather as many real user inputs as possible. We should be gathering real customer questions, commands, and other relevant utterances. Once we've gathered those real user inputs, we need to break them down into categories. These categories are going to formulate the basis for our intents. We have to ensure that our intents or categories define a unique purpose or goal. If those intents overlap, we run the risk of confusing our classifier. Although important to ensure intents have a unique purpose, there may be cases where it makes sense for them to overlap. For these cases, it's typical to use entities to clarify the intent. We'll see how to do this in a future section on entities. Once we've collected our initial set of user inputs, categorized them, and defined our intents, we're not necessarily done. We can still improve by retraining our classifier. And there are two basic ways to do this. One is to improve our training data. We can do this fairly easily by collecting more user inputs and mapping them to existing intents. Two is to refine our intents. This also requires collecting more user inputs. We might find that new inputs don't map to an existing intent. In this case, we might create a new one. There may be also cases where we decide to split intents or delete them or potentially use an entity to clarify them. All in all, training our classifier becomes an iterative process. It's something we'll continuously improve. Fortunately, improving the system is very easy. The Watson Conversation Service provides us with excellent tooling. We can easily add new intents and new examples simply by interacting with a graphical user interface. The user interface also makes it very easy to import a new CSV file. Something very similar to what we saw earlier. We simply add examples and map them to new intents. In a coming lab, we'll walk through how to use this tooling. In this module, we learned about intents, some best practices around training an intent classifier, and finally, we saw a sneak peek into some of the Watson conversation tooling that makes training a classifier very easy.